the Université du Québec à Montréal. Her current research focuses on epistemic injustice and agency in relation to various themes such as colonialism, indigenous issues, multiculturalism, racism, deliberative democracy, linguistic justice, think tanks, cognitive disability, neurodiversity, and the underrepresentation of women and other minorities in certain fields. During her sabbatical in 2019-2020, she was a faculty fellow at the Center for Ethics and Public Affairs at the Murphy Institute at Tulane University, where she was working on several papers and a monograph on epistemic injustice and agency. And today, Amandine Catala is going to talk to us about autism. So Amandine, if you want to share your screen.
Great. Thank you so much for this introduction, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen. And as I was just telling Sarah and Anne-Marie, I'll be sharing my screen as a PDF because I'm having trouble, as always, sharing the PowerPoint. So it's going to be in a PDF. So thank you so much, Sarah and Anne-Marie, for organizing this talk series. It's been great to be able to attend all semester, and also great to be able to present my own work today. So thanks very much for that. So as Sarah was just saying, my name is Amandine Catala. I'm an associate professor in the philosophy department at the University of Quebec at Montreal, where I also hold the Canada Research Chair on Epistemic Injustice and Agency. And today I'll be talking about epistemic justice and epistemic authority on autism. So the idea for the talk starts from two observations. The first is that autistic people often face multiple forms of epistemic injustice in many contexts, whether medical, clinical, familial, social, professional, or academic. And the second is that epistemic injustice often undermines autistic people's epistemic authority regarding their own experience of themselves and of the world. So my aim in this talk is to identify and argue for criteria that justify epistemic authority on autism and that foster greater epistemic justice for autistic people. So to do that, the outline for today is going to be as follows. I'm going to start with some brief methodological remarks, and then I'll go on to defining the key notions of epistemic injustice, agency, and authority. And that'll bring me to turn to the next 2 points. First, the notion of neurotypical ignorance, and second, the distinction between propositional and experiential knowledge. And I'll say a little more about that, but the idea here is that I think it's going to be pointing us in a helpful way to potential criteria for epistemic authority on autism. And I'll conclude by saying a little bit about some of the implications that this has for research on autism. So with that, let's get started with the methodological remarks. So as you probably know, there's a very famous slogan in disability movement and disability studies and scholarship in general, which is nothing about us without us. The idea here, the us and the we, are disabled people, scholars, and activists who are basically saying you should not be doing things about us or talking about us without us. So the idea here is that it's very important to include in any endeavor that concerns disability to include first-person perspectives of disabled individuals. So along these lines, I thought I would mention that I'll be approaching this topic today from a first-person perspective as an autistic woman, philosopher, and scholar. And having said this, I, of course, am not and do not claim to be a spokesperson for the autistic community, which, as any community, is a relatively large and heterogeneous one, including with respect to intersectionality. Related to this, in terms of methodological remarks, I think it's also important to emphasize the language I'll be using will be identity first language. So for example, autistic person, identity first language is a type of language that's preferred by many autistic self-advocates, including myself. rather than person first language, which goes like person with autism or person with ASD for autism spectrum disorder, which tends to be predominantly used in the medical sphere, the social sphere, and also the academic sphere. So that's for methodological remarks before we start. Having said this, let's now turn to our first key concept, which is epistemic injustice. Very generally speaking, we can see that a person suffers epistemic injustice if she is either not adequately believed, meaning that she suffers a credibility deficit, or not adequately understood, meaning that she suffers an intelligibility deficit, because she belongs to a non-dominant social group, and more specifically due to certain types of biases that affect these groups. So the two main types of epistemic injustice identified by Miranda Fricker in her 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice and Power and the Ethics of Knowing, are testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice corresponds to an undue credibility deficit, and hermeneutical injustice corresponds to an undue intelligibility deficit. So let's look at each of these in turn with some examples. So to illustrate testimonial injustice, you might imagine a police officer who does not believe the truthful testimony of a Black witness because the witness is Black. In this case, the witness is not adequately believed, meaning that they suffer an undue credibility deficit. And this deficit is due to the hearer's conscious or unconscious biases about the social identity of the speaker. So here, the fact that the speaker or the witness is Black is the object of a bias in the interlocutor's or the hearer's credibility judgment. Now, turning to hermeneutical injustice, to illustrate hermeneutical injustice, you might imagine a woman who cannot communicate as such her experience of sexual harassment because the term does not yet exist. And so the woman and the experience that she's trying to communicate is not adequately understood, meaning the woman suffers an undue intelligibility deficit. And this deficit here, this time, is due to biases in the society's pool of conceptual or interpretive resources due to the exclusion of certain groups from the processes of conceptual production. So the idea here is the term sexual harassment is missing. And this is not by chance, is because there are certain biases in what Fricker calls the hermeneutical resource of a society. So that's the pool, like I say here, of a conceptual interpretive resources. So everything that has to do with social meanings, shared understandings, collective representations, all of that is going to be part of what Fricker calls the hermeneutical resource, and it's biased when basically certain groups are hermeneutically marginalized. Hermeneutical marginalization is what I describe here as this exclusion of certain groups from the processes of conceptual production. So that's to explain two main types of epistemic injustice that are testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. So let's relate the notion of epistemic injustice now to epistemic agency and epistemic authority. Epistemic injustice is going to undermine epistemic agency and perceived epistemic authority. The idea here is that if you're not adequately believed, meaning that you're facing testimonial injustice, or if you're not adequately understood, meaning that you're facing hermeneutical injustice, that is going to seriously undermine your epistemic agency, namely your ability to produce, use, or transmit knowledge. And it's also going to undermine the perceived epistemic authority. That's the idea of whether you are viewed as qualified to speak on a given topic. And that's to be contrasted with actual epistemic authority, which is whether you should be viewed as such because you are actually qualified or adequately positioned to speak on a given topic. So you can see that there is a distinction between perceived and actual epistemic authority, where perceived epistemic authority is a descriptive notion, it's a factual matter, if you will, Whereas actual epistemic authority is a normative notion, it's an evaluative notion. So perceived epistemic authority, whether you are viewed as such, that's descriptive. Actual epistemic authority, whether you should be viewed as such because you are actually qualified or adequately positioned, that's a normative notion. So with these concepts in mind, now we can go to the claim that autistic people face epistemic injustice in several contexts. So if we turn, for example, to the medical or clinical sphere, neurological or cognitive differences are going to be described as disorders or deficits. Um, in the social sphere, there is this widespread supposition that autistics lack sociability and empathy. We can imagine the professional educational sphere that differences in processing, whether cognitive or sensory, might be stigmatized. And in the literature on epistemic injustice as well, paradoxically, there can be epistemic injustice with regard to uh, uh, neurodiverse or in this case autistic individuals. So that's what I call meta epistemic injustice, in the sense that it's an epistemic injustice that concerns the very concepts that we use to define epistemic injustice, epistemic agency, epistemic trustworthiness. So one thing we'll come back to later is that it's not uncommon in the literature, even in the literature specifically on epistemic injustice, to find this idea that if you're not looking someone in the eye, or if you're not speaking confidently, then it's okay to give you diminished credibility judgment. You're not meeting this norm that you're supposed to look people in the eye, you're supposed to talk confidently, and if you don't meet that norm, then you are not an epistemically trustworthy agent. And that really is problematic, in particular with respect to autism, as we'll come back to later. So there you have it, in very many different spheres, really ranging from all across the possible spheres you can think of, epistemic injustice is very much present in the lives and experiences and realities of autistic people. In all of these different situations that I've just described, autistic people are not taken seriously as knowers, so they suffer epistemic injustice. They will be viewed as unreliable locutors or interlocutors, and likewise, they will be excluded from the production of mainstream concepts. So when you're viewed as an unreliable locutor or interlocutor, you face testimonial injustice. When you're excluded from production of mainstream concepts, you face hermeneutical injustice. So either way, you're not taken seriously as a knower, and you suffer epistemic injustice. So that's really going to undermine, of course, epistemic agency and perceived epistemic authority, despite the fact that autistic people often have actual epistemic authority on their own situation or experience. So let's say a little bit more about distinction between perceived and actual epistemic authority. It's possible to have the one without the other. And in a sense, that's essentially what the problem, or at least partly what the problem of epistemic injustice is, right? So you might have, as I've described before, a person who is actually who has actual epistemic authority, but who is not perceived as such. So if you go back to the case of the Black witness I was talking about earlier, that person is giving a truthful testimony. They actually have epistemic authority, but they're not perceived as having epistemic authority on the matter at hand. And so that's where we say that they suffer an undue credibility deficit that's due in this case to their social identity. But the problem is more completely or more comprehensively and therefore more adequately or accurately describe the problem of epistemic injustice, not just as a problem of a credibility deficit, but also a problem of credibility excesses. So deficits are one side of the coin, and excesses are the other side of the coin. This is something that's pointed out by Jose Medina in his 2013 book. And the idea here is when you have someone that does not necessarily have actual epistemic authority on a given matter or area of knowledge, and nonetheless is perceived to have such authority. And here we can think of many examples, including in the medical and psychiatric profession, where there's a tendency to believe third personal accounts by psychiatrists or sometimes even family members over the first personal accounts of psychiatrized individuals. So the idea here is that we can speak about a credibility deficit or a credibility excess relative to basically how you should normally be believed. So what you're actually what you actually have epistemic authority about. So that points to a key notion in standpoint theory, which is the importance of social location for knowledge production. The idea here is that your social location, so how your membership in a particular social group and how that group is positioned in the social structure is going to give you access to a certain type of experience. You're going to experience the world in that society from the vantage point of the position that your group occupies. And therefore, your social position gives you access to a particular type of social experience, and therefore also to a particular type of knowledge about the social world. And conversely, you can also imagine, so this notion of a social location means that some people are going to have a certain experience of the social world and other people are going to have a different experience of the same social world. So if you go back to this originally Marxist idea that if you ask a capitalist to describe a capitalist society, they will tell you that capitalist society is a society of freedom and abundance and wealth. And by contrast, if you ask a member of the proletariat or the working class, they will say that a capitalist society is a society of exploitation and scarcity and poverty. And so you have two very different viewpoints, but the idea here is not just that you have differences in viewpoints based on your experiences, but that there is one type of viewpoint and more specifically a standpoint that is giving us more accurate representations and understandings of the social world. And that's the point of view of the oppressed, so the proletariat in the Marx example, but in any other axis of social identity or social inequality, it'll work as well, right? So whether we're talking about race or gender or class or disability, that translates over. And so I should also say, as you can see on the slide here, that this idea of standpoint theory, so as I said, has roots in Marxism, but was most prominently developed by scholars like Nancy Hartzog, Sandra Harding, and Patricia Hook Collins. And we also had the wonderful opportunity to hear a really great talk by Phoebe Friesen in this Philosophy of Psychiatry series, specifically on standpoint. So if you haven't had a chance to see that talk, you can do that on the website of the series where all the recorded talks are posted. And so basically what we can get from this idea of social location is this idea that on the one hand, we'll have certain individuals that have an epistemic privilege. So the idea is that they're not socially privileged through their oppressed position that they occupy in a social structure, but they are epistemically privileged, meaning that the knowledge that they have access to through the experience that they have as members of an oppressed group is going to be more accurate to represent the social world that they're experiencing every day. The counterpart of epistemic privilege, however, and this is where we need to be very careful, is that it's not just that the oppressed have an epistemic privilege, it's also that the dominant groups tend to have what Mills calls epistemic ignorance. So the problem of epistemic ignorance, Mills, as we'll see in a moment further, develops this specifically in the context of race relations. But one thing he says about ignorance, which is very important, is that it is not just the lack of accurate knowledge. It's also the presence of false beliefs, of distorted knowledge. And so it's very sort of pernicious, because the idea is that dominant groups will think that they know accurately. It's not just that they won't know and they'll recognize that they won't know. Very often, they won't know that they don't know, and they won't know that they don't know because there is a form of knowledge that's occupying, that's taking up that place, and it's distorted knowledge, and it's knowledge that's distorted by their socially privileged, not epistemically privileged, but from their socially privileged position. And so there is ignorance here as a counterpart to epistemic privilege, where epistemic privilege is something that members of non-dominant groups tend to have, whereas epistemic ignorance is something that members of dominant groups tend to have. And I say for each non-dominant and dominant groups, I say members tend to have either privilege or ignorance. And the idea here is that, of course, privilege or ignorance are not automatic. It's not just in virtue of your social position, you automatically have either privilege or ignorance. It is possible to have, as a member of a non-dominant group, to have a false consciousness or internalized dominant ideologies. And likewise, you may, as a member of a dominant group, come to have a more critical point of view on your own social positionality, which we'll talk more about later as well, and therefore sort of counteract the default ignorance that usually comes with your social position. So another way of saying all this brings us to the second to last point on the slide here, is that basically there's an important distinction to make between propositional and experiential knowledge. The idea here is that in order to produce accurate propositional knowledge about a certain section or of the social world, you're going to want to make sure that this propositional knowledge is informed by experiential knowledge. So again, it's third personal statements should be informed by first personal statements. And this, I think, can point us to criteria for actual epistemic authority, as we'll see. But so let me say a little bit more about ignorance, which I think is a key notion here. So as I say, Mills in his 1997, The Racial Contract, defines white ignorance as a quote, pattern, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. And he goes on to say, quote, that part of what it means to be constructed as white is a cognitive model that precludes self-transparency and genuine understanding of social realities. So we can see here in these two passages that there are two aspects which I've called subjective and objective ignorance. These are not Mills's terms, but they are based on his definition. I do think that that is what we can see in his definition. So we see that we have, as he says, members of non-dominant group who have what he calls cognitive dysfunction, so who have a cognitive model that precludes self-transparency, that's subjective ignorance. So the subject of knowledge is sort of ignorant of itself. And as a result of that, then we have distorted understandings of reality, and that's what I think Mills is getting at. So let's look a little bit more at ignorance as both subjective and objective. So as I was saying, in subjective ignorance, the members of the dominant group experience their privileged position as so natural and normal that it becomes imperceptible and unquestionable to them. So there really is a lack of self-transparency of the subject of knowledge to themselves. So members of the dominant group will not realize their social position, so they will lack this sort of transparency about how they come to know the world and the sort of cognitive models and dysfunctions that they have. So as a result of that, then we run into the problem of objective ignorance, which is the other part of Mill's definition, which is that as a result, then members of dominant groups will misunderstand significant aspects of the social world, and that means that they will lack an adequate understanding of the object of knowledge, namely social realities. Now, Mills also interestingly in later work points to the possibility that ignorance in the context of race relations is wide ignorance, but for example, in the context of gender relations or sexual orientation, we might have things like male ignorance or heterosexual ignorance. So what I'd like to propose here, following something I've argued in a piece with colleagues from UQAM, Luc Fauché, who will speak next week, and Pierre Poirier, that just like we can have white ignorance, male ignorance, or heterosexual ignorance, and so on, we can also have neurotypical ignorance. And that neurotypical ignorance is due to neuronormativity. So let's go look at what neuronormativity is. In that paper, we define it as we define neuronormativity as the prevalent neurotypical set of assumptions, norms, and practices that construes neurotypicality as the sole acceptable or superior mode of cognition, and that stigmatizes attitudes, behaviors, or actions that reflect neuroatypical modes of cognition as deviant or inferior. So neuronormative assumptions, norms, and practices uphold standards regarding, for example, what is neurotypically considered appropriate eye contact, facial expressions, prosody, conversational flow, processing, and responsiveness, all of which can be difficult for autistic individuals to understand, sense, or apply due to neurocognitive differences. So the idea here is that neuronormativity, what's described here on this slide, creates what I call neurotypical ignorance. So let me explain neurotypical ignorance by going back once again to wide ignorance. So what Mills tells us is that basically under the system of oppression that is racism, that system of oppression both creates and is maintained by a particular set of assumptions, norms, and practices that we might call white supremacy. And white supremacy is going to produce wide ignorance in both its subjective and objective dimensions. So there's going to be a lack of self-transparency of the subject to themselves. They're not going to realize that they're socially positioned in a particular way. And they're not going, more precisely, they're not going to realize how their social location affects their understanding of the world. And so that's going to lead to objective ignorance, the lack of adequate understandings of social realities. And so similarly, in neurotypical ignorance, the system of oppression at play is ableism, and more specifically neuroableism. And this system of oppression, neuroableism, is going to again, create and be maintained by a particular set of assumptions, norms, and practices, which is neuronormativity. And neuronormativity will produce neurotypical ignorance. Again, in both its subjective and objective forms, meaning that neurotypical subjects will not typically realize their social positionality as such, and the fact that this limits their understanding of certain social realities like neurodiversity, for example. And so as a result, we'll have objective ignorance, again, the lack of adequate understandings of social realities. So I think this brings us to the possibility of identifying one criterion for actual epistemic authority, which is that in order to claim actual epistemic authority on autism in this case, you really need to have awareness of both subjective and objective neurotypical ignorance. So you need to be able to show that you understand both of those things, not necessarily in those terms, but essentially what they mean, which is that you realize that you are socially positioned as a neurotypical person in a particular way, which also limits your understanding of certain social realities. In a sense, it's a way of cultivating what Medina calls epistemic humility, recognizing your epistemic limits based on your social location in this case, and trying to access knowledge from other sources, in this case, from autistic people. So I also want to know, this is very important, that this awareness is a process rather than an outcome. You can't just leave this talk and be like, oh, I understood awareness of both subjective and objective neurotypical ignorance. And good, got it, okay. No, this is something that you really need to cultivate over time. It's a process. It's something that needs to be developed and repeated and practiced. And so it's really basically, yes, a way of approaching how you produce knowledge always. So that's very important. So how should we address the subjective aspect of ignorance? I think, again, like I said, the key here is to be aware of social positionality, and more specifically, the fact that if you occupy a dominant position in society, you are going to have epistemic limits, in the sense that should bring you to realize that you have a limited understanding of certain social experiences and realities. And so that brings us to addressing the objective aspect of ignorance, which is that basically, if you are not adequately positioned or qualified to talk about a particular segment of the social world or experience or situation, then really you should recognize that others might be better positioned and qualified to do so. And that's what I mean by the epistemic trustworthiness of autistics. Again, this goes to the distinction between propositional experiential knowledge in relation to epistemic injustice in particular, but this idea that when you have experiential knowledge, you produce propositional knowledge that's more accurate. So this is what I explain in this next slide, that if you basically ask yourself a little bit more specifically about different types of different possible types of knowledge, it's not just propositional knowledge, it's also non-propositional forms of knowledge, like tacit, embodied, or affective knowing. This is something that I borrow from Shotwell in her 2011 book. The idea here, to illustrate these different types of knowing, if you go back to, for example, the case of sexual harassment, this is a case I talk about in the 2020 piece that's listed here. The idea is that, yes, there is obviously a problem with propositional knowledge. There's a conceptual gap. So obviously a conceptual gap has to do with propositional knowledge. And so there is a problem there, which is very well described by Fricker, obviously. However, even in Fricker's account, the way that she describes the situation, you can, even though Fricker doesn't put it in those terms, you can actually see that there's other types of knowings that are going on there as well, that are just as important, in fact, are necessary in order to articulate the missing concept that then leads to new propositional knowledge in the form of the creation of the term sexual harassment, which then gives rise to the proposition about sexual harassment happening and things like that. So if you go back, like I said, to the case of sexual harassment, women there, for example, also have a form of tacit knowing. So tacit knowing is all these things that, again, sort of norms and assumptions and these sorts of things that are not sort of explicitly articulated or spoken. They're tacit, but nonetheless, you could put them in a propositional form, but still they're not really typically explicitly articulated. So in this case, for example, of sexual harassment, you had the tacit knowing or understanding that women were supposed to put up with that kind of behavior from their male peers around them in whatever context, including the context of work, that their bodies were objects that others could play with at will, and these sorts of things. And they were supposed to understand that that was just good fun, and that if they didn't, they were accused of lacking a sense of humor and being uptight or being prude and what have you. So that is all a part of a set of tacit norms and understandings that regard the status of women and the status of their bodies. So precisely, that means that there is also embodied knowing going on in this situation. Of course, sexual harassment is something that's experienced very strongly in the body, and it can also have ramifications and effect that are in the body, so aches and pains and other sorts of things. And there's also affective knowing, in the sense that women who experience sexual harassment, even when the term wasn't coined yet, really felt very strongly that something was wrong, and they felt anger and frustration and all sorts of different affects. And so we can see in the situation that of sexual harassment, just to take this case, that the relevant knowledge at play or at stake is not just the conceptual gap, the propositional knowledge that's missing. It's also, there's something more that's going on underneath that has to do with experiential types of knowledge that are not necessarily propositional, like tacit, embodied, and effective knowing. And so the idea is that propositional knowledge about a particular situation or experience is more likely to be accurate when it's informed by experiential knowledge of this particular situation or experience. And that, I take it, is just another way of putting what I was referring to earlier as standpoint theory. That's my understanding or reading of it anyway. I think this is basically another way of capturing what's being said in standpoint theory in terms of propositional versus experiential knowledge. So the idea that your social position gives you access to a particular slice of the world, and therefore knowledge comes from your experience of that particular slice of the world. And so including experiential knowledge and propositional knowledge. And so if we were to apply this to propositional knowledge about autism, the idea here is that before talking about or for autistics, allistics, that's non-autistic individuals, should consult and listen to first personal testimonies from autistics who can offer a critical perspective. And I highlight the word critical here because I think it's important to note, and this is something that I said earlier too in the context of standpoint theory, just because you're autistic, so just because you're a member of a non-dominant group, doesn't mean that automatically you have a critical stance. And things like false consciousness are possible not just in the context of class relations like Marx described, but also in the context of neurodiversity, and it's possible that neuroatypical people will internalize stereotypes about themselves and come to feel bad about their situation and actually come to view themselves as inferior and problematically different and things like that. And so I do want to stress that just being autistic does not give you a critical perspective or stance. I do think that we have to be careful about the internalization of problematic norms, and that's something that's a problem across all systems of oppression equally, whether it's racism, sexism, or in this case, neuroableism. Okay, so that's basically by way of introducing the second criterion for actual epistemic authority, which is that propositional knowledge that's inclusive of and informed by a first personal experiential knowledge from autistic people is more likely to be accurate and therefore to grant actual epistemic authority. But again, I say this importance of the critical stance is crucial here. And one thing I really want to stress that I think is really, really important is that if you do gain propositional knowledge that's informed by first personal testimonies from autistics, really that's going to require modifying and revising certain beliefs in light of counter evidence that you get from this, from these first personal testimonies in order to counteract what others have called active ignorance. Medina in particular, I think, uses that, or definitely uses, and I believe even coins the term, but it's something that comes back in the feminist social epistemology literature in general. But very interestingly, Yergo and Hübner in their 27 piece in the Journal of Social Philosophy called Minding Theory of Mind, very nicely show how it's actually quite common for people who engage with autistic people to retain their biased beliefs regarding autism. So in this particular case, they cite a host of studies that show that basically autistic people are not deficient, quote unquote, when it comes to theory of mind, that they perform just as well as neurotypical individuals. And so despite that, though, despite this counter evidence to this theory of mind that's so deeply anchored in the literature, Yergo and Hübner say that research hang on to this original theory of mind and to their original beliefs, and they refuse to revise and modify their beliefs accordingly based on counter evidence. And when that happens, then we have a problem of active ignorance, where it's just you're purposefully dismissing, you're selectively sort of precisely selecting what you will take into account or not, in the face of your best evidence. So that's obviously something that's required. So it's not just a matter of consulting, and it means genuinely including and doing the epistemically right thing, which is to revise your beliefs accordingly. So that's for the second criterion. And I'm reaching the end here. I will briefly summarize here the two criteria that I've identified for actual epistemic authority on autism. So I talked about being aware of both objective and subjective neurotypical ignorance. That was the first criterion. The second criterion was to make sure that propositional knowledge is based on or informed by first personal experiential knowledge from autistic people. I believe that the adoption of these two criteria will bring about greater epistemic justice for autistics, and in the sense that it takes them seriously as epistemic agents, as locutors or interlocutors, and as contributors to conceptual resources and social meanings, understandings, or representations about autism. So having summarized these two criteria, this is my very last slide. I do want to say just a little bit about what concretely that means in terms of implications for research on autism. And this is obviously in the medical context, but also in the academic context. I think that to practice and foster epistemic justice in the way that I've just described, we need to consider new types of potential sources of information and knowledge, right? Because the typical sources, especially in medical research or academia, are going to be sources that are biased against, most of the time anyway, autistic people. And so it's not necessarily the case that you can take for granted that if you have a research article on autism, whether from the medical sciences or philosophy or something from the humanities, that you can take for granted that these articles are informed really by first person, or that they're not biased, that they're aware of neurotypical ignorance, that they are sort of careful to not reproduce neuronormative assumptions and standards and the like. And so I think what that means, again, is that we need to be open to the sort of plausibility of including new types of sources that do not reproduce these sort of exclusionary biases. And so that means, for example, turning to, who knows, maybe things like autobiographies or forums or Facebook groups and things like that, that basically are where autistic people can be and sometimes gather and exchange. And so where you can find knowledge from first personal perspectives. I'm also wondering about requiring a methodology section, especially in philosophy where it's not so common. So actually, when you read about autism, you read a lot of things from psychology and the medical sciences, and you always have a methodology section. We don't have that in philosophy, and it's kind of an interesting, we can speculate as to why, but I think that we really ought to. I think we need to explain how we're proceeding, what are our assumptions, what is our method, and what we're doing to counteract potential sources of biases and problematic assessments of that sort. And so I think that could be something to require and introduce. And just more generally, and this goes for academia, but also everyday life, I think it's important to be able to identify and counteract neuroableism, just like we would sexism or racism. And that includes viewing neurodiversity in terms of natural range of variations across the human spectrum. And not in terms of hierarchy, and understanding that anything that's labeled a deficit or a disorder obviously is socially constructed as such. Right? I mean, you can see that women or Blacks are going to function and flourish less well in a sexist or racist society. That does not make them deviant or inferior. And in the same way, you can see that autistic or neuroatypical individuals are going to function and flourish less well in a typical neuronormative society. And again, that doesn't make them deviant or inferior. So having said that, I will stop the screen sharing and we can turn to discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amandine, for this great talk. We are now gonna be able to take questions. So if you would like to ask a question to Amandine, can you write in the chat that you have a question, and we will give you the opportunity to ask her your question.
I think there's the question from Jean-Nicolas.
Sorry, yes, there is a question, a first question from Jean-Nicolas.
Hi, my microphone's working?
Yep.
Okay, cool, perfect. First of all, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, when it comes to stating one's situated position in relation to, well, in this case, it's autism, but I'm interested in neurodivergence in general. I was wondering, well, it's something I myself struggle with. I'm wondering, given the possible repercussions of outing oneself as neurodivergent, do you have any like thoughts on how one could state their first person epistemic authority without maybe like, you know, taking that step or that risk given the current situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a really great and important question. Yes, I didn't mean to convey, although I can understand how that might have come across this way, that there's an obligation for neurotypical individuals to disclose. And I fully understand how the ramifications or repercussions that disclosure can have in certain contexts. So I absolutely didn't mean to imply that. What I meant more specifically to say is, and in fact, it was probably more directed at neurotypical individuals, which is simply to become aware of your social positionality and recognize that that comes with certain epistemic limitations, that you need to turn to other people who may have first-personal testimony, relevant first-personal perspectives to offer to counteract that kind of epistemic limitations that comes with your socially privileged dominant position. But certainly, I think that's something that's completely understandable and defensible not to want to disclose. And certainly I would not want to be construed as requiring that on my account. That would not absolutely not be something that I would want to say. So I hope that that clarifies or answers that concern. But do feel free to come back if I'm not fully understanding or addressing your concern.
Yeah, thank you. That was it was actually really just
Okay.
I was not thinking about your.
Oh, yes. Okay, perfect. I see what you're saying. Yes, yes. Okay, good. Okay, so I see. So there was no misunderstanding on my view, that I'm not requiring that's clear, but still it's a concern. And I do understand that. And I yeah, I mean, really, that's up to everyone, whether they want to disclose, whether they don't want to disclose. I think both positions are perfectly understandable and defensible, and how much they want to get involved in terms of once they disclose, you know, do they want to create a platform for awareness and self-advocacy and these sorts of things. And I don't think anyone has an obligation to do that. So that's just what I would add to that. Thank you, Jean-Nicolas.
Right. We have a question from Roxane Noël.
Hi, nice to see you again after all that time. Yeah, so, well, I'm going to be the annoying person who has two questions, I guess, but you can just answer one if we're like short on time or anything. It's just I can't choose. But yeah, like the first thing I was wondering about is how it's always an issue for me, because I feel like there are cases where this sort of false consciousness or lack of a critical stance is quite easy to identify, but I'm always kind of wondering what could be sort of criteria to recognize that the position that someone adopts is one of that comes from a false consciousness or and so on, or internalized say neuroableist thinking. And the other thing I was wondering about is I guess that second one is more broad, but sort of thinking about intersectionality, especially. So we know, for example, that a lot of cases of women, well, autistic women go undiagnosed for a very long time, and that the stereotypes about being autistic are very, very much based on kind of a more generally male experience of it. So kind of how to address that within that framework, and making sure that by including more firsthand experience, sort of testimonies or sources of information, that we're bearing in mind these intersectional issues.
Yep, thank you so much, Roxanne, for coming and for your questions. So yeah, so the first, I'll answer them in order. I agree that there is always, you know, it's not necessarily always that easy to recognize whether something is internalized in false consciousness or if it's sort of more autonomously and critically endorsed. I think something that can really help here is hopefully that you're not thinking all alone by yourself in your little corner, but that you're able to exchange with the relevant community, other members in the relevant community. And that's something that I think can be very helpful in terms of understanding different things that you might have internalized. And in a sense, I think it connects to your second question, because one of the reasons that basically because of the fact that autism is typically viewed as a male issue.
Your Honor, at this time the defense rests.
Thank you. Mr. Blackwell, does the state have rebuttal?
So because autism is often viewed as a male issue, it means that women are underdiagnosed, and also they are, at least for people born, like I would say around 1980 and before, they might just be missed altogether. You know, there's this idea of the lost generation. And so if they are not missed, or if they're able to be diagnosed later on, they might have gone like several decades of their life without propositionally knowing that they were autistic. And so that means that they might have also internalized certain norms and sort of assumptions and everything, because they always viewed autism as an external problem and not one that they were actually directly experiencing without knowing it, or propositionally knowing it. And so what I mean by that is that it can be also helpful in that case, especially maybe when it's new for you, if you're diagnosed in your teens or 20s or 30s or later, and you've had several years, if not decades of your life without knowing, like I think turning to a group about precisely sort of sorting through what's wrongly internalized and what you really sort of identify with or recognize yourself in can be helpful. But you're absolutely right that there's a real problem of intersectionality here, namely the intersection of neurodiversity and gender, and that and also we should also be careful to say that it's not just the gender binary. There's actually a lot of trans people who are autistic as well. It's not just a problem with the underdiagnosing of women. There's also, and we don't even have, I don't think, as much data yet on trans people who are autistic, although it seems like it's not uncommon. It's a fairly prevalent thing to have autism amongst trans folks. So yeah, so really, I think that there is a lot to say and do about rectifying this perception that autism is a male problem. And I think the problem is that the diagnostic criteria are made by and for and based on male perspectives and phenotypes. And so absolutely we need to change that, because otherwise we have a vicious circle of it's only people who seem to meet the criteria that get referred. And so we have obviously the perpetuation of underdiagnosing, which is highly problematic. I agree. Thank you.
All right, the next question will be from Justin Garson.
Great, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed your talk and I learned a lot from it. The only question I had was that when you were talking about the different expressions of epistemic injustice, you used, as an example, using the term disorder or deficit or maybe dysfunction instead of difference.
Mhm.
And I've always, and this isn't about autism in particular, but I've generally thought of those terms, disorder, deficit, dysfunction, as, literal medical terms that could be correct or incorrect, terms that are overused and that we have to be really careful about them and not throwing them around when calling something a deficit or dysfunction when it's not. So I just wasn't sure. Sorry, I don't have a clear question. I guess, was your viewpoint that it's not a deficit or a disorder, and so you shouldn't call it that? Or even if in some technical sense of the term it is, we still shouldn't call it that because doing so is just perpetuating epistemic injustice?
Yep, I understand the question. So I think that it's not just a matter that it is, but we shouldn't call it that. I really think that it's not even really how we should think about it in the first place. So I think, so there's this really great passage. I actually was just looking at it before, and I debated whether to include it in this talk, but there's a book, I forget the first name of the author, but the last name is Armstrong, and it was published in 2011. And he says basically that, you could imagine a world where psychiatrists are roses, and they declare that sunflowers suffer from hugism, and tiny bluets from growing disability, and calla lilies from PDD or petal deficit disorder. And so basically, what that shows, I mean, it's a bit dystopian and absurd, but what that shows is that anytime you talk about deficit or disorder, you're by definition, you're doing that with respect to a pre-established norm that you take to be the default and the standard of reference, which seems strange. I mean, that just like the person is saying there with the flowers, why should we compare normalcy or abnormalcy or something, as opposed to just differences in, for example, the variety of flowers that we have, and the same in terms of the variety of neurocognitive profiles. So I agree that there are differences. Of course, that's what, and that they can be real neurocognitive differences. I just don't know that it's accurate, first of all, but also necessary or useful to call them by that term, which is a stigmatizing term, which leads to this sort of understanding that people are troubled or disordered or dysfunctional, or that they struggle or suffer from something. I mean, this negative pejorative language is ubiquitous, and I don't think that it's either accurate or fair. So I think the problem is both at the level of the description and the level of normativity, if that answers the question. But feel free to come back if you had more about that.
No, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. We have a question from the chat from Sheila Messon. What do you recommend for casual conversations about autism or racism, sexism that will help combat stereotypical thinking?
Well, that's a big question.
Could I just say what I had in mind? As having taught philosophy for many years, I was always preoccupied with bringing the abstract conceptual richness of philosophy and other disciplines to ordinary people, lay people. And my concern is, we know that bias of various sorts against many groups, racism, sexism, there's no end. And it's so deeply embedded. And I've been watching the Chauvin trial and very concerned about deeply embedded bias. And so I wonder, at the ordinary lay level, how can we introduce the idea of epistemic injustice, which is a term that doesn't go well at in casual conversations? Is it just enormously difficult to unseat these opinions, especially when you talk about people who are dealing with autistic people but don't revise their stereotypical opinions? So it's a question about how to revise what strategies we have in ordinary conversation to loosen at least the hold of bias.
I mean, I think maybe one step is just to make people, like I said, realize that perhaps there's things they don't understand, like I said, in virtue of their social location. It's interesting. Your question reminds me of a question that was asked actually of a Black woman on the news. I don't think she's herself a news anchor, but she was being interviewed on a news program, and I forget her name, unfortunately, in the details of the situation. But essentially, she was being asked by a white man who was saying, you know, I'm seeing, you know, all these Black criminals on TV, and then I'm being told I shouldn't be racist, but you know, I don't like to be told what to do. Like if I see crime on, it seems like it's a reasonable conclusion to draw. And the woman had this wonderful sort of response, which was to say, well, first of all, you know, there's biases in the way that the news selects what kind of crime is reported, white crime versus Black crime, or mentioning race when it's a Black person, but not when it's a white person, these sorts of things. And eventually, so she said basically sort of be careful about what source of information you consult, or maybe turn off the news. But also she said, I mean, try to become familiar with Black people, but you get to know them. You'll see that they're not all sort of, you know, criminals or whatever they're portrayed to be, according to various stereotypes that, as you say, are very pervasive. So I thought that was a really great way to approach it, and it turned out that actually the two of them became really good friends and had really productive exchanges and everything. And anyway, but so I think that's it. I think first is epistemic humility, suspending judgment at the very least, maybe realizing there are things you may not know because of the way that society is structured and the kind of experience and knowledge that you do or do not have access to, and then trying to again talk to, listen to, interact with people in an open-minded way, and then revise your beliefs accordingly. So it's obviously, I don't mean this to be an exhaustive or a definitive answer, but I think it can be one way of addressing your concern. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
All right, the next question will be from Bennett Knox.
Hi. Thanks so much for the talk. It was great. I wanted to get your thoughts on this possible sort of double bind. And you talked about sort of one side of it, which is insofar as autistic people are seen as or are not able to navigate social norms well, that can undermine their sort of perceived epistemic authority. But then on the other side, there's insofar as some autistic person is able to navigate social norms well, they may be seen as like less autistic or not autistic enough to have the relevant critical perspective to get the sort of, you know, perspectival knowledge that you're talking about. So how do we navigate that dynamic, I guess?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a great question. It's a very important one too. And I will tell you that exact question is addressed in that piece by Yergo and Hübner that I mentioned earlier. It's a 2017 piece in the Journal of Social Philosophy. And because Melanie Yergo, as she says in the piece, is autistic herself. She works in rhetoric, I believe, in Michigan somewhere, if memory serves me. But so she is saying like exactly what you described, which is that if you manage to be articulate enough and sort of navigate social norms, then your testimony is going to be dismissed as an autistic person anyway, precisely for that reason. You're not autistic enough to, which again, sort of just says, well, if you don't conform to our stereotypical construal of what autism is and is not, then we won't believe you either. So you're completely right. But so basically, I mean, what she says is that it's a joint article, but they speak in dialogue. So it's one voice after the other. And but yes, what she says is that we need to rethink basically how we construe. She also says, you know, I'm viewed as high functioning or something like that, but never as just plain functioning, right? So I agree that it is definitely a problem. I don't have a straight answer to it, but like what I can do, like I said, is point you to that article that sort of focuses on that more specifically, and also Yes, again, I think this really invites us to, I think the problem here, again, is one of hermeneutical injustice, because at the root of all this is the representation, a sort of collective understanding of what autism is or is not, or what it should look like and what it should not look like. And so, again, I think what we need is to have autistic people that contribute to how autism should be viewed, which is as a very internally diverse category where you have tendencies, you have traits, but the way that these traits manifest is extremely different from one person to the next. And so therefore, some of them may appear as if they navigate social norms better and others not. And there's also, of course, probably compounding this issue that you're pointing to is a problem of masking or camouflaging, which is also something that's often observed in autistic girls and women, which is that they're socialized in a way to be a bit more observant of social norm, actually, and a bit more receptive or pressured by these sorts of norms, and so they will also adopt and adopt the norms. So it's sort of like forcefully trying to fit in the neurotypical norm, in neurotypical mold, in a way that, like I said, is called masking or camouflaging. So where it involves both performing like a neurotypical and also hiding your neuroatypical traits. So like, for example, refraining from flapping or stimming and these sorts of things. And that compounds, I think, also what you said. So thanks for your question. It's not nearly as satisfactory an answer as I'd like it to be, but yeah, it points in some direction. Like I said, do go look at the Yergo and Hubner piece. It's really great. And thanks for your question.
All right, the next question will be from Patricia Roy.
Yes, thank you first for this amazing presentation. I really enjoyed it. So hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes.
So I was wondering, I don't know whether it's a comment or a question because it doesn't make sense in my head, but I was thinking about the connection between active ignorance about neuroatypical people, for example, and also the fact that the mental disorders are diagnosed from the neurotypical perspective, which might be problematic because then, as Bennett, you discussed with Bennett, there is this problem of, how can I say that? This problem of validating your identity as a neurodivergent person, because you have to prove that you are neurodivergent enough in order to get some diagnosis and help. So I was wondering whether it would make sense to say that maybe that the whole process of diagnosing might be or problematic in the sense that it contributes to active ignorance about autism or neurodivergences overall. Does my question make sense, actually?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Thanks, Patricia, for your question. I think we should be careful not to toss out the baby with the bathwater. So I personally, I agree with you that diagnostic criteria as presently formulated and also diagnostic instruments as they are applied are probably imperfect a lot of the time, especially when it comes to the intersectionality of neurodiversity and gender. But I do think that having a diagnosis can be extremely helpful, and not just in terms of self-understanding, so the sort of hermeneutical justice we're talking about having an area of your experience that that is no longer obscured from your self-understanding, that is actually accessible to you now for your understanding because you have a diagnosis. So I think a diagnosis is useful not just for these hermeneutical reasons, which are already, I think, very important, but also for socioeconomic reasons. So it's not just a matter of epistemic justice, it's also a matter of social justice. I think that, we know that autistic people can have a harder time secure and retaining employment, and that they're often not adequately diagnosed, and that there's other sort of diagnoses that will be enter in the picture. There's a lot of comorbidities, so-called comorbidities. And so that all that means that having finally an accurate diagnosis can make it the case that you have access to services or accommodations or communities and different things that might be very helpful for you. And so while I agree that diagnostic criteria are imperfect, or at least they're imperfectly interpreted or so understood and applied, and we may need to revise diagnostic instruments, I am not necessarily of the view that we need to dispense with a medical diagnosis altogether, or that a medical diagnosis serves no purpose and that it's all about self-identification. Having said that, I also want to say that I know that there is a major problem of access to diagnosis in the first place. It can be costly both in time and money. And so I understand that this is not by way of ruling out self-identification, but it's more by way of ruling out the possibility of getting rid altogether of the medical diagnosis. That's what I would say.
All right, we have a next question from the chat from Cathy. So she says, how should women or people with high functioning autism go about to validate their experiences of autism when it is not able to be diagnosed properly or recognized in society?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm not sure. I'm not fully understanding from the question if it's understood that these people, that the women in question already know they're autistic or not. But if they don't, like I said, I think just here is really, I think, a place where the solution is partly epistemic, which is just find out more about what autism is and what it's not, how it presents, especially in girls and women. And that's something that's accessible in a host of different ways. There are some clinical studies that are very interesting in that respect. So there's also a gap between, oh, I'm so sorry, I said the clinical, I mean, there's the reverse. There's some medical, sort of more like academic studies that are done that show very nicely, basically, differences in phenotypes and things like that, in a way that is not necessarily understood or applied as such in the clinical. So basically, people who receive patients for or people for evaluation and diagnoses and things like that. I do think, again, it's a matter of getting the right information and then making sure, as we can see in those research articles, they say like there is a lack of like the transfer of information, the sort of inertia of the clinical field is tremendous. Even though there's lots of research articles that say like basically these criteria are outdated, or their current interpretations, the way they're currently applied is leading to missing a lot of autistic people, in particular autistic girls and women. So that's what I would say, that if you think you might be autistic, or you learn about it and everything, that you can find out more and then maybe seek an evaluation if you need that confirmed. The other thing I was going to say is, if you already know you are autistic, then this, I feel maybe goes back a little bit to Bennett's question, which is if you're high functioning, quote unquote, and you're not sort of living up to the stereotypical expectation of what autism is or looks like. Yes, like I said, that is potentially actually that is a real problem. But I also think that, again, normally, if again, there's a bit of sort of education of people who tell you, oh, you don't look autistic or this or that. Like, you just like, oh, I don't view you as Black, or I don't see you as Black or something. It's the same sort of thing. Like that all those things are meant as compliments, but they're really not. And so I think, again, you can kind of get to hopefully a little bit further in communication with these types of responses, if you can counter it by saying, by explaining to people differently, or by pointing them to certain resources or forums or these sorts of resources, which again are very much informed by first personal perspective. So that's what I would say. But I think it's a real problem, though, to deny a person's diagnosis. And also, and I think that's another thing I want to say about high functioning is that, so I'm personally, I don't like this distinction between low and high functioning. And the reason is, I think, first of all, it creates this sort of, it just reproduces a hierarchy that I think as autistics, we should just be against and denounce. It's not okay, you know, just like it's not okay to view high functioning individuals as inferior. It's not okay to view low functioning individuals as even more inferior or something. So I think that there's a problem there. That's just not the right way of going about it. And the other thing too is that I think by labeling so-called high-functioning people as such, you're also erasing the very real difficulties that they still face in everyday life. Because yes, you may be able to seemingly conform more easily to certain norms and everything, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and things like autistic meltdowns and shutdowns and burnouts are real. And so I think that anyone who says, you know, oh, you're high-functioning, so really you don't really have a problem and then your life is easy and whatever, is just displaying plainly their objective ignorance. So I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind here. You know, we only interact with each other a portion of the time. We're not with each other 24/7, and you don't know what's going on in people's lives. And so again, I think it's an invitation to epistemic humility and suspension of judgment. And Fricker says this: if you're not sure, epistemic justice sometimes requires suspension of judgment, right? So the problem is not just that you judge by giving a credibility deficit. And so, of course, you would like to ideally be able to recognize the person's epistemic authority and just give the right allocation of credibility. But if you can't do that, at the very least, you can suspend judgment. And she says that, you know, next time you have sort of a strange interaction, something doesn't seem to make sense, you want to take someone not seriously, maybe consider the possibility that something is wrong with the way you understand the situation rather than the way that this person is interacting or behaving in the situation. You know, and so that's what I wanted to say. So thanks, Kathy, for your question. I hope I kind of interpreted two different ways, whether diagnosis is known or unknown, and I tried to address both sides of this question. And so I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Maud Sincaster. My question might not be clear, but to which extent could self-diagnosed autistic people have epistemological authority on autism, neurodivergence, or issues specific to neurodivergent experience?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question too. And again, an important one, which goes back to the point I was making earlier, that there are different reasons why you may not have access to a diagnosis. Like I said, it's costly, both in time and in money. And I don't think I would want to disqualify autistics who are not diagnosed as having epistemic authority, to the extent that they genuinely believe, of course, that they are autistic for the fact that they know what autism is, or maybe they know other autistic people and they recognize themselves in those traits. I think that if that's the case, I think you can, this is a personal thing. For me, it was important to have access to a diagnosis and to have this confirmed. But I also know and understand people who don't necessarily want or need that confirmation, who just kind of know. Sometimes it's also because autism, as we know, runs in families. And sometimes you have people around you who've been diagnosed, and you just sort of, you know, you're sort of like their social twin, so to speak, as like you really, the way that they interact socially, you very much see yourself in. And so you can kind of, you know, there's a bit of something there that tells you in a sense. So, I mean, I definitely don't want to disqualify that. I think as long as it comes from a genuine place and that there's a real understanding of what autism is and is not, that it's not instrumentalized. I was hearing horror stories about how people use autism as an excuse to just be rude or insensitive or whatever, and that's just wrong. So Julie Daché, who's this great blogger from France, has this blog. It was on there actually that I read that. So anyway, by the way, if you want to yourself get more familiar with autism or introduce someone else to autism in the more feminine phenotype, you should definitely consider reading her book. It's a graphic novel, and in English it was just published in the fall. It was published several years ago in French, but it's called Invisible Differences by Julie Daché, and it's wonderful. And as long as I'm doing this, I will also recommend that everybody go look at Aspie Girl, which is another fantastic webcomic made actually by some wonderful people who are just both these projects in comics and webcomics are just terrific to introduce people to autism, what it is and what it's not, and it's they're really great. They're doing wonderful things in terms of hermeneutical justice. So.
All right, we have another question from the talk from Maud Provost. I wonder if it would be accurate to talk about different standpoints and different information from epistemic privilege, if someone is good at masking or not.
So I'm not sure that I understand the question, but I mean, the thing is that once you become aware of what autism is, you also realize what masking is, and so I think that people who mask, don't mask all the time, obviously, and so I think that you can still say that these people have access to the autistic standpoint. I mean, I think you could imagine, for example, a trans person who may, in order to self-protect, go by their original first name and gender in a work context because they're afraid precisely of disclosure and the repercussions that can have, sometimes including being fired. And so presenting as their original first name and gender. And so in that sense, you could say that they are masking or they're passing. But still, that wouldn't change anything to the fact that they still have access, that they're still a trans person, they still have access to the trans standpoint, if you will. So, and likewise, similarly for an autistic person who might be masking, if she knows she's autistic, she would still have access to that standpoint. And again, I just want to stress that regardless of whether you're masking or not, I mean, the critical stance is very important here. Like I said, it's not automatic, right? But it's something that you develop, and that is also collectively mediated, like I was saying, that the standpoint is sort of, it's not an individual empirical perspective, right? It's something that's more critical than that, and that's more reflexive and also forward-looking in terms of goals and changing and transforming things. So yeah, so that's what I would say.
Okay, is there any other question? All right, so I think we can thank our speaker of today, Amandine Catala, for her fascinating talk. It was very interesting. So Amandine, thank you so much for being here. And I would like to thank, of course, all of you for being here today, for asking nice questions. And if you like the talk and the topic, we continue the series in 2 weeks with another talk on autism and epistemic injustice. This one is from Luc Fauché, who's a professor at UQAM. So the talk would be entitled Autism and Epistemic Disablement, and it's on April 29. Also, I will take this opportunity to share another event. So this weekend, there's this the APP meeting, so Philosophy of Psychiatry meeting. I'm gonna share the link in the chat. So it's a conference. Like broad conference in philosophy of psychiatry for those of you who might be interested. So thank you so much everyone for being here today, and seeing you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.